Kintsugi Heroes acknowledges funding and was made possible with support from the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. Welcome back to Kintsugi Heroes, helping people tell the stories they need to share so you can find the stories that you need to hear. In this episode, John Millam had a chat with Jamie Toyne, who has navigated a life full of challenges and growth. Diagnosed with ADHD at a young age, Jamie faced burnout multiple times, once as a pro tennis player and twice as a business owner. These experiences pushed him to understand and harnessed flow states to combat stress. Jamie's journey includes deep personal reflection, tracing his roots and striving for authenticity. We hear how Jamie shares how he faced his trauma, found balance, and now helps others do the same. Enjoy this one with Jamie Toyne.
Well, welcome listeners to Kintsugi Heroes. Once again, stories that matter. And today we've got a wonderful opportunity to hear quite the adventure from a young man, Jamie Toyne. So welcome to Kintsugi Heroes, Jamie, and thanks for coming, mate. And to be honest, you're here because you've got one of the most, energetic stories, right? For a bloke who's, still young and still got most of his life ahead of him, mate. So I thought I'd just start with your bio, right? We got to introduce you to the world, and then, mate, I thought we'd explore some of the adventures you've been on and some of the things you learn along the way. That's all right. So Jamie was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and you've burnt out 3 times in your career so far, mate. So already racking up a fair total. Once as a tennis player, playing on the pro circuit, and twice owning your own businesses, right? And of course, like any young bloke with curiosity, you went and searched the connection between ADHD and burnout and flow, right? Which is a state as proposed by Csikszentmihalyi, one of the giants of psychology. And you developed a coaching program called FlowJo. I love that, right? Which helps ADHD founders and business operators to cure burnout, right? Harness their ADHD superpowers and start flowing towards their goal. And you're the author, mate. You've done a book as well, Pressure Gauge Mindset, and founder of companies called Dead Flow and Exit Planner. And you've helped more than a deal flow, sorry, not dead flow, right? And you've helped more than 400 entrepreneurs successfully exit businesses, right? Which is a unique prospect. Getting out is as important and as difficult sometimes as getting in. So well done, mate. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. It's good to have you on with you.
Mate, fantastic. Now, there's so much to talk about, but I'd love to start with, mate, who you are. Who do you see yourself, and where did you start building that identity from? Who was young Jamie, and how has that influenced Jamie of now?
I think I'm still figuring that one out.
Yeah, well, I reckon it's a work in progress. Where have you got up to then?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for sharpening it. So I grew up in Australia, as you can hear from accent. Born in Melbourne, but my parents split when I was 6, and my mum and I relocated to Alice Springs in the Red Centre. So my formative childhood years were there between 6 and 16, really. And a little backstory to that. So my parents, when I refer to my parents, I refer to my mother and father who adopted me and raised me. Well, mum raised me, really. But yeah, so mum and I moved to Alice Springs when I was 6. So yeah, I went to school there. I guess my identity as a child was like the naughty kid. Yeah, I was pretty disruptive in class, always getting in trouble, often spent a lot of time on home suspension rather than in the classroom. I was extremely hyperactive. And on the school's recommendation, I went to see a pediatrician, was diagnosed with ADHD. Mum was not having a bar of medicating her 11-year-old with methamphetamine. So I continued unmedicated and continued to struggle in the classroom. But luckily for me, there were certain things that I could hyper focus on and really excel in. And one of those was sport, all manners of sport. But as I got, I think so 14 or 15, I started to really focus on tennis. Soccer was my other big sport that I sort of travel around the country for. And tennis, sport, in general, was just a saving grace for me because I was able to develop, good relationships with a coach, and so it wasn't that I just had issues with authority. It was that I had issues with focus and classrooms in general and doing things that I weren't interested in. So I'd say sport was a big part of my identity. I relocated back to Melbourne. I got a scholarship at a sports school. And they sort of prime you to go into the American college system. And they had the sort of American college grading system. So you have to get certain grades and certain behavior to be able to continue to play the sport. And of course, I continued to play up in the classroom. So I didn't get to play tennis at the tennis school. But I was at a level then where I was part of the Victorian sort of state squad. And the Australian Institute of Sport wrote a letter to the Victorian Department of Education and asked for permission for me to drop out of school and to finish my schooling by correspondence through distance education. So I was sort of like a digital nomad before there were digital nomads. So there I was sort of traveling around the place. I joined the pro circuit when I was 16, competing, staying in hotels and just doing my year 11 and 12 studies between tennis matches and training, essentially.
Wow. That would be a challenge for anyone, let alone a young bloke with, some, geographical, confusion, as well as, your biological confusion, your difficulties, as well as an ADHD diagnosis. Man, you were sort of biting off a lot. How did you manage to stay productive and stay sort of within boundaries?
Well, I didn't at all. I really struggled. I think you're right. I think, I've been a digital nomad for more than a decade. And, one of the biggest things that people struggle with when they work for themselves is managing themselves, and being their own boss is really hard. And they're often pretty nasty bosses at that. We're really nasty bosses to ourselves. So yeah, an unmedicated teenager with ADHD, it was a lot. So I really struggled. I would say that my tennis sort of went downhill as soon as the pressure was really on. When I joined the men's circuit, I was 16. I had a bunch of sponsorships, and most of them were fun because it was free tennis rackets and free clothing and shoes. But one of the sponsorships I got was actually quite rare, and it was more like an investment. So there was a very wealthy individual who was an absolute tennis fanatic, and he invested in a couple of people in Australia, sort of like betting on horses. And the deal was that he would pay. I was raised by a single mother who's a social worker. She had a small wage, so she was spending 30-40% of her wage on my tennis. And so this took a lot of financial pressure off my mum. He paid for my travel, my training, everything. In return, he got a 10% cut of my prize money. Now, at the level I was playing in the tournaments I was competing in and the prize money I was winning, he wasn't going to see $1 return on his investment. But if I cracked that sort of top 50, it might have paid off to be a good investment. And so I was one of 3 horses that he backed in Australia. And the pressure was incredibly hard. And I really got into my head. And it was actually on my 18th birthday when all my friends were finishing school and going off to schoolies to party. And I was playing a tennis tournament and losing badly. And I smashed all my rackets and I forfeited the match, and I never played again. I quit that day.
To this day, or have you captured tennis back again?
Yeah. I jump on the court from time to time to have a friendly bash, but I haven't played a competitive tournament since then.
Man, that's huge, right? So, the foal he backed, in the end, you were fast, but, burnt out, right? Yeah, wow. So that is, it's a classic case. Hey, just to backtrack a little bit, right? Because there's a lot. You're being asked a lot, asked to to be someone, who I would not expect, a person in your situation to be able to sort of handle, and anyone in that situation to handle. So did that leave you did you blame yourself, or were you looking for someone to sort of point your fingers at? Did that leave you sort of angry at the world, or?
Yeah, I just certainly didn't blame the sponsor. I mean, it was a great opportunity. It was a lot of pressure, but the pressure was really I put on myself. I think at the end of the day, he probably saw himself like a philanthropist more than anything else. But I put a lot of pressure on myself. I think, I didn't figure this out until 10, 15 years later. But I talk about this a lot in my work. But, we have different parts of us that represent they're almost like protectors that sort of protect our vulnerable parts based on internal family systems therapy. But I talk about higher self and lower self, or what I call the higher self, the general, and the lower self, the workhorse. And so, or mind and body. And so I was really in my head. I really wanted to get to top 50 in the world, and I was all the way back here. And my higher self wanted to be there today. And it didn't matter how many matches I won or how hard I tried or trained. I wasn't achieving that goal now. And so I never really celebrated my wins. I never really gave a high five to the workhorse, my lower self, who was actually the one that had to jump on the court and do the work. And my lower self, was exhausted, stressed out of his mind, and started to rebel against my higher self, started to slack off in training, started to throw tantrums on the tennis court, and sometimes purposefully lost tennis matches, essentially, because I just didn't want to do it. I was miserable. I was unhappy.
In some ways, that sounds like you were modeling your own behavior in a macro sense, right? When you were back at school, right? So
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
I talk about the carrot and the stick. So, I hated the schooling system because it was all about punishment and reward. And it didn't really work for me. I just wanted to find something that felt good in the moment, which I later discovered is flow, and why I became obsessed with flow, because as Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi describes flow, it is an autotelic experience, which means that the action is rewarding in and of itself. So you don't need to discipline yourself or dangle the carrot of reward in front of yourself to get yourself to move up the hill. You just love doing what you're doing, and all of a sudden you're halfway up the hill. And so that's what tennis was for me to a point. And then I got really in my head and started using the carrot and stick. And I essentially became my own, a worse version of the schooling system, essentially. And I rebelled just like I did in the classroom against myself. Absolutely.
So going back to that young teenager, right, who in Alice Springs, which is a challenging environment for anyone to move into, right? So clearly your mum working in social work, she was also challenged and focused in a high needs area, right? How did that, and there you are adopted. How did that play out? Did you have a thought about tracking down your bio parents and finding out who, a bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, you don't really question much as a kid. It's only when some kid goes, "Why is your mum white? Why doesn't your mum look like you?" That you go, "Oh, I always knew I was adopted. I had an open adoption, and I was very lucky to be adopted by my mother because she's one of the most incredible humans in the world." And yeah, I think her knowledge of, traumatized kids and families and working in social services for so long, I was very lucky because she nurtured me in a really beautiful way that allowed me to, she let me drop out of school. Some parents wouldn't allow that. So I was very lucky, but it wasn't until much later on did I start really digging into the identity and belonging piece. So I had an open adoption, so I knew who my biological mother was from birth, and mum would take me to visit my biological mother who lived interstate. She lives in Adelaide. And she remarried. She's a Greek woman. So my roots are Ghanaian and Greek.
Wow.
I stumbled. There's a bit of a story to why I stumbled there because I found out some new information about my roots quite recently. But my Greek biological mother had 4 children, my siblings, and so I've always had a connection to them. I visit them, every year, and so I always knew I was adopted, but of course, I've done therapy since I started doing therapy when I was 16, sports psychology. And then after I quit tennis, I sort of kept carrying it through. So, I'm pretty aware of the things that are created through those traumas. Essentially, you're in this comfy, familiar womb with this familiar noises and smells and sounds, and then you sort of burst out into the world, which is usually traumatic anyway, but then you never get attached to those, that person again. I was put in a foster home for 3 months and then adopted, and then just the classic parents separating and dad leaving overseas with someone that he fell in love with and not seeing him for a few years, and him always living, he moved back to Australia, but then living interstate. So I didn't have a particularly integrated relationship with him throughout my life. And mum never had another partner. So it was just really me and mum growing up. And we have a beautiful relationship.
It's an extraordinary series. Did you feel like you were more like, well, clearly, you struggling. It was a non-traditional situation with school and, problems with being put into boxes. But you had lots of it sounded like you had lots of resources around you and so on. Would you say that kind of, organization, while, not normal, what's normal, obviously, but do you think that was a net positive in your life, having access to your biological mum and your adoptive mum's resources and, other things?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't describe them as resources so much. I mean, your primary carer is an absolute resource. I wouldn't necessarily consider my biological mum a resource, but it was, it was nice to have a connection to that part of me, but also really confusing in a lot of ways, and definitely some hard moments. I mean, it was an open adoption on my end, but there was a lot of secrecy in her family. Not all her family members knew about me. My grandparents didn't find out that I was alive until well after my grandma passed away, and maybe 2 years before my grandpa passed away. So yeah, I remember I have memories of being a kid and visiting, and the grandparents popping over and then having to hide me in the house. So yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges in that relationship with my biological family, to be honest. But overall net positive. Like there's love there, and I don't. What I reflect on is probably just the way I was nurtured by my mother who raised me, and I think I had a couple of friends that grew up in the same small town, and one's now not around anymore. And, I was kind of pretty lucky to, Alice Springs can be a pretty rough place for young people. And sport was really a haven for me to sort of channel a lot of that energy. Otherwise, who knows what I would have put that energy into,
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of which, because then, jumping out, like when you talked about 18, right? And that moment when you said you broke your rackets and walked off, right? How, did you know what was happening at that moment, and how did you, move forward from that point, which is a pretty dramatic life point when you look at it, right?
Yeah. No, I didn't know that I was quitting forever in that moment. It probably took me another 6 months, but I was so burnt out. And so I decided to take a month off, and then a month rolled around and I still didn't want to pick up a tennis racket. Probably wasn't for 6 or even 12 months until I sort of really admitted to myself that I didn't want to do this. And I'd split year 12 over 2 years, so I could manage the schoolwork. So I sort of, that following year, I just finished off school. All my friends had finished school and were having the funnest year of their lives. So I sort of just joined in with that and started partying and having fun. And it was just so exciting. And I was significantly happier. And I just wasn't an option to go back to being unhappy. Yeah. And then I went to business school.
So did you classify burnout as burnout later on in life when you realised?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so business school, a kind of non-traditional educational profile, but business school, and you jumped on and then took on a lot of sort of tech and sort of entrepreneurial challenges. Was that your new tennis?
Yeah, in a way it was. I think I approached uni or like tertiary education very practically. I was never going to do a liberal arts degree because I was sort of like, I had a clear idea of how I wanted to live. I had no idea what I was interested in. And so it made sense to go to business school because if I could learn how to commercialize my interests and my passions, I could do whatever I want. And I sort of always had that vision of the digital nomad thing, even back then before it was really a thing. But the idea of being able to travel around and go to conferences and meetings, and my dad, he was a social activist, and a land rights and environmental activist. But he did a lot of that, traveling around to conferences, and he worked from home in his beautiful house, and so I had a bit of an influence from him. So that's why I started. I was never very techie, and I've never been techie. But of course, there's a lot of opportunity in tech, and what I liked about tech was the company culture. It wasn't a stale environment. And back then, I think I finished uni in 2009, I think, or 2013, maybe 12 or 13. Yeah. They had a table tennis table. They had a beer fridge stock, the fridge stocked with beer. They had beanbags all over the place. And like, that was just exciting. And so I went for it. And I just sort of went with the flow, and I got very lucky. I think the other thing about it, tech companies are they're usually run by young people. Sometimes they explode with growth, and you could be employee number 4 with a little bit of experience, and the next moment be the director of a 30-person department. And that's essentially what happened to me. I got in at the right time as an intern. 6 months later, I'm being relocated to San Francisco to set up their North American operations.
In Silicon Valley? Right.
In Silicon Valley, grew a team of 20 people, and had a really great time over there for about 3 years.
That's got to be a head mess, mate, right? Suddenly you find yourself, in an IT sense in nirvana, right? Like, how does the ego, how does that, and that youthful energy, how does that all cope?
Yeah, I thrived in that company because I brought in that same intensity that I'd learnt to train with on the tennis court. So I was in there early. I was leading. I was the first one in and the last to leave. I had a lot of my particular role involved working with people all around the world. So I'd be in the office at 4 a.m. running online webinars. And so I made an impression on the founders, and they took a risk with me and sent me over there. And I didn't let them down. We had tremendous success over there.
Which leads me immediately to think, you've already started pushing yourself and setting that, those expectations. So inevitably happens, the same thing as the last time. Have you gone too far? Did it all come crashing?
It didn't when I was working for them, for that organization. I started buying small internet businesses and flipping them, and set up my own brokerage company at the beginning of 2017, really. And there's a bit of a story behind how that happened, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But essentially, I'm running a company headquartered in San Francisco, and I moved to Mexico shortly after that because it was my business and I could live where I wanted. Large percentage of my clients were based in the US, so I wanted to stay on a similar time zone, but live somewhere cheaper. I've always wanted to learn Spanish. I'd done some travel through South America earlier on in my life, so I moved to Mexico and learned Spanish and learned to surf and had a great time there for a couple of years. And then I burnt out, and it was quite a big burnout actually. Really similar to tennis, but I stepped down as the CEO of my company, put an interim CEO in, and I packed up my bags and I flew back home to Alice Springs of all places to stay with mum. Yeah, it was it was sort of like, I was really living the dream there for a while. I sort of was, put myself in a pretty good position financially and just having a good time. And then I burn out, and I never really recovered from that burnout to the point where I fell out of love with the business during that burnout. So I after the 6 months, I decided that I was going to sell the company. So that's what I did.
So had you learnt the process to recover from burnt out yet?
No, it wasn't until that second burnout that I started to think, what's going on here? And that's when I sort of discovered flow. Sort of like, well, what's the opposite of burnout? What's that? I want to, like, why can I, what was that feeling I used to feel on the tennis court, or sometimes you feel on the dance floor or in the bedroom or, wherever. And why can't I get more of that? Why am I always so heavy and miserable and exhausted? And so I felt like flow was the antidote to burnout. And so I went really deep on flow, read all the books on flow, historical books, as well, like Eastern texts on sort of the philosophy of flow, and started doing all the things that you do to basically hack your body or your biology, your mind and your body, to get into a flow state. So for listeners, if you know what a flow state is, it is a temporary state of altered consciousness when we are essentially performing at our best, when our sort of thoughts and decisions and actions sort of seamlessly start to click. And we're sort of really absorbed in the present moment. And there's a bunch of, indicators for flow states. There's certain neurochemicals that show up in the brain, dopamine being one of them, norepinephrine, anandamide, and a few others. So I got really deep on that, and I thought that was the answer. And in a way, I sort of really did learn some great things, ice baths, saunas, breath work, yoga, microdosing psychedelics, taking supplements for sleep and focus and all kinds of things. But I burnt out again 2 years later. And so when I burnt out that third time, at that point, I was running a government-backed accelerator program. I published my book, The Pressure Gauge Mindset, and I had launched my first software company called Exit Planner. And I burnt out again. And this time it was less work-related and probably more personal life-related, I would say. Some big things happened, some related to my adoption, and, tracking down my biological father and some drama around that. But the point, what I really learned from that third and final burnout, which was about 4 years ago, was that flow may be the answer, but the way I was approaching flow was not the answer.
That's fascinating. So, like, I love that you touched on the definition of burnout, of flow. Just to backtrack, how do you define burnout?
The easiest way, I just say when you're chronically stressed, overwhelmed, and exhausted. A better definition of that might be, to be mentally, emotionally, or physically exhausted or stressed. We tend to have a negative attitude towards ourselves and others. We have decreased motivation and just overall decreased energy. But I think the key is chronic. I'll talk about stress another time, but stress isn't necessarily bad, but chronic stress is bad. But yeah, I mean, and when you're, there's a sliding scale of everything, and that includes burnout. So when I talk about the three, I've experienced burnout. You can experience burnout on a weekly basis. When your energies are low, but to have that experience of burnout where you cannot get out of bed and you cannot bear, like looking at, like, I remember trying to lift the lid of my laptop and it being too heavy for me to lift, not physically, but I couldn't do it. And I remember after my second burnout, a friend told me that I had to buy a new computer because there was bad juju in my last computer, because I had a physical reaction to my laptop. Yeah.
So if we define that, physical, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, exhaustion, right? Which makes sense to me. So and then you said, well, flow is a state of optimization of all of similar sort of matching areas. How do you, and you discovered there's more to flow and the more to the answer to deal with burnout. So take us down that path.
Sure. So what I was doing for the most part, what I took from my understanding of flow in those 2 years between burnout 2 and burnout 3 was a very narrow Western lens of what flow is, which is this, which the word flow in the West has now become synonymous with flow state or peak performance, which is this altered state of consciousness. But if we look at the East, flow, the concept of flow has been around since the ancient Greeks. They called it enthusiasmos. The Taoist monks called it Wu Wei. The Zen Buddhists called it Zazen. And then Maslow called it peak experiences. So there's a long history leading up to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in the 70s calling it flow. And it'll probably be called something else in 50 years. But essentially, our understanding has become narrower and narrower. And if you look at the Eastern understanding of flow, it's more about a way of being rather than a temporary state. I mean, the science shows that we can consistently unlock a flow state for up to 4 hours a day. And I mean, we're talking like the LeBron Jameses and the Beyoncés of the world. The average Joe is probably not getting 20 hours of flow state in a week. So that's a very small fraction of our life. And there's a lot that happens outside of those 3 or 4 hours we spend in the flow state. And so it was outside of that time. I mean, I was performing well in work, but there was other things happening that were not flowing at all. And one of the big things that I look at with flow is alignment, energy alignment. Flow is energy. And so, when the easiest way to explain energy alignment or not, or energy flow rather, is if I put energy into something, does it flow back to me or does it not? So if I put energy into a relationship, is that energizing, or is that am I relating with an energy vampire? They're draining my
energy. Yeah, you're draining it. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And if you continue, I mean, it's just like, if you think of burnout like a battery, if you're continuously putting energy into something and the energy's going out and you're never really getting juiced up or feeling flowy or relaxed or peaceful, then yeah, you're going to burn out. That's the easiest way to describe it. And so, they talk, particularly in the Tao and the ancient Chinese sort of philosophy of Taoism, they talk a lot about flowing water and the flowing river. And the analogy that I, build on is essentially, if we think of ourselves like a river, when there's a bunch of boulders in the middle of our river blocking the water from flowing down its natural course, we feel blocked. And if we don't address those boulders, we get less and less flow, and to the point where we're completely blocked and we burn out because we're not getting any supply. And so my approach is really simple. I just remove the boulders now. So I just and I have developed a system of identifying what that boulder actually is, because often it's really hard. You might say, I'm burnt out because I work 60 hours a week and I'm just working too much, but my business is great and this is great and that's great. It's just that I work too much. Well, why do you work too much? And you start to dig deeper and deeper, and the real boulder is actually something often a lot deeper. And if we can remove the boulders from our river starts to flow again.
Yeah, wow. And I love the idea, the boulders under, in the middle of the stream, right? Of course, the stream then becomes very turbulent and kind of, circular and stuff. So a bit chaotic. So you mentioned right up front, like in your bio, the idea of ADHD being a part, early diagnosis and probably a way to describe some of your challenges at school and so on. How did how did ADHD manifest for you? How did you learn to deal with it? You mentioned superpower. How does it become a superpower?
Yeah, great question. So, particularly, I mean, it doesn't matter if maybe it's even easier for kids that are diagnosed with ADHD as a kid, as a child, in some cases, because at least you're aware of why your behavior is different. And, but most people are diagnosed as adults. And so they've lived their whole life feeling like they've been told they're unacceptable. They've told that they're lazy, or, they can't focus, or they're disrespectful. And so essentially, whether you've been diagnosed or not, essentially we've been told that this is a neurodevelopmental disorder that we need to manage. And yeah, I mean, it took me a really long time to sort of embrace my ADHD and figure out ways in which I could leverage it and harness my ADHD to become my superpower.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I mean that's really the essence of the program that I've developed, which is called Flojo. So it's really I use Flojo because I take the word flow and the word mojo, get your mojo back. And mojo means unique magical power. It's an Afro-Caribbean word that means unique magical power. So really it's about, a great example for me in a way is the fact that I was able to escape the classroom and play on the tennis court. It was building an environment around what I was interested in, what I was passionate about. It's about following that energy. When I was in the classroom as a kid, I was putting energy into making people laugh and having fun, but that was not appreciated in the classroom at all. I mean, I got shamed and punished. And so, yeah, I think, the simplest way I can explain how to harness your ADHD is really to get clear on what your strengths are, what your passions are, what your values are, and what sense of purpose you have. And then once you're really clear on you, then look at everything around you, from relationships to the way that you interact with business or creative projects or staff or business partners or whatever, and make sure that they all align with you. I'm shrugging my shoulders and saying it like it's simple, but it's actually really confronting and hard work.
Well, it is, especially given, like research tells us that, by the age of 10 or 12, right, a kid with ADHD has heard 20,000 more negative comments than a kid without ADHD. And so every 10 years of someone, you're probably going to encounter another, that 20,000 extra sort of negative or assessments, right, even as an adult. So, and so it must be very, it forms a view of yourself. And I'm interested in you've gone ahead and taken on new challenges all the time. Was that how did you manage to break out of that sort of framework of criticism and, lack of self-worth that so often ADHD causes kids to have?
Yeah, such a great question. Do you remember me talking about higher and lower self?
Yeah.
Yeah. So another way of describing how burnout works is that relationship. What snapped inside of me, what caused me to smash my rackets and quit, what caused me to pack my bags and go back and live with my mum, was that relationship between my higher and lower self completely exploded. And it had been in tension and conflict for years. And so getting those two parts of you to work together as a team it's a really challenging thing, particularly when we are our own nasty boss and we have a lot of negative self-talk and we're very hypercritical of ourselves. But yeah, I mean, I work with my clients. I'm constantly working with systems that, and this is connected to unlocking flow states, but creating positive dopamine cycles. I mean, one of the things with ADHD is that, I mean, usually we have a lower sort of default mode of dopamine, but actually what it is that our dopamine cycles are dysregulated. So some actually have higher amounts of dopamine, but it's the way that dopamine is released in our brain. And so setting up these sort of positive feedback loops that are smaller and tighter. So for example, I had a miserable time writing my book. It took me 5 years to get the thing out. And, had I have created a newsletter or social media and taken bits of it and shared it as I was creating it, I would have got some positive dopamine from it. So, I think just going back to the tennis career, it's really obvious, but I didn't celebrate my wins. Even when I won a tennis match, I didn't celebrate winning the tennis match because unless I won the tournament and then got a certain ranking and then, I was moving upwards like that, it didn't really, I hadn't learnt those skills yet. But now I would say my higher self is much kinder to my lower self. And they work together a lot better.
It's interesting. I've often encountered, with ADHD, the wins or achievements are not celebrated because that's maintenance, right? And it's the next one that's more important than the last one. So there's no time to celebrate because, all very well to get a trophy for something, but it's the next trophy that's now becoming more important than the last, right? So, you move straight on without celebrating. So yeah, that seems to fit. It's a great. So as a young, you're very young to have worked this out, and many of us, take 50 years to become wise around how to look after yourself, right? So what you had lots of different stimulus. What do you think was a reason that you were able to sort of work out stuff so quickly?
You made me giggle, and you can't see it because of the complexion of my skin, but you've made me blush too. I don't know if anyone's called me wise before. But
well, welcome to the circle of elders, mate. You just don't have the grey hair, right? Yeah.
I dye it. Definitely, yeah. So I wouldn't say wise, but I'll reframe your question so I feel more comfortable answering it. So why have I searched so much and discovered so much about myself? And I would say it has a lot to do with my adoption. Most people when they're born, they have a mom and a dad and a brother and a sister, and they start life with some very basic answers about who they are, and I didn't start with that. Yes, I knew who my biological mum was, but I didn't know why she gave me up until I was 28. I didn't know any of the context of that, and all I had was a tiny photo of my biological father and a name, and that's all I had. That's what I grew up with, and so and I was raised by Anglo-Australian parents. If you can't see this and you're listening to this, I've got curly hair and dark skin, and I was always different. I went to a school. I've always sort of existed in a white world and sort of felt like the black sheep in a lot of ways, and I've always had many questions about who I am and where I belong and stuff like that. So yeah, just deep questioning, existential anxiety, and depression, and I've had a long struggle with mental health, and so I've done a lot of therapy. I've done a lot of different things to regulate my ADHD, but also my anxiety and depression, and try to enjoy my life as best I can. So I think honestly, that's probably why I've done such a lot of thinking around this stuff.
It's really thanks for sharing that aspect of you so honestly, right, mate? So because in the bio, right, we tend to put our a positive spin on, but from my perspective, I'm incredibly impressed with having depression and anxiety and still being able to adventure and challenge yourself and survive, essentially, that the stepping out of your comfort zone. Is it all right if I ask a little bit about that? What did you do, and what did you learn from challenging your diagnoses, your depression and anxiety? It would have been easy. I'm looking at all of this activity and adventure and engagement with the world, which is not normally part of somebody who is struggling with depression and anxiety. And I'm wondering how, was that movement part of trying to deal with it or get out of it, or did you unlock a way to put it aside and still take action? It seems like a really resourceful way to take it on.
Yeah, interesting question.
Maybe to clarify, like my when I'm anxious and depressed, I tend to lock up, right? I tend to to hide, but it looks in some ways the opposite. Is that true? Or am I just
Yep,
putting a
it is true. Yeah, I think yeah, you mentioned the trophy thing before. I talk about this alter ego of mine called the trophy chasing monster.
right? Is this part of the group in your family systems? Is it the
Yeah,
monster?
yeah. And as
Yeah.
long as I'm chasing trophies and winning trophies,
Yeah.
no one's going to abandon me and no one's going to reject me because I'm winning.
Right. Yeah.
And
Cool.
I'm valuable. This
Yeah.
is a physical symbol of my value as a human in a
Nice.
community that will accept me if I have lots of these. I think is the subconscious there. So yeah, and I would say I've had depressive episodes. I wouldn't say I've suffered from chronic depression. I've suffered from chronic anxiety, and so it's not a comfortable feeling to be anxious. So sitting in the anxiety is not particularly nice. So doing things and distracting yourself and avoiding uncomfortable feelings, and so the moments when I quit tennis, that's when I and took 6 to 12 months off. That's when I sort of dipped into a depression and then partied and felt and then, after my, moving back in with my mum, going back to my hometown, and just gardening, tending mum's garden and doing therapy. I mean, nothing. That was a really hard challenge. But I was busy, and then that's when I went deep on my, my history with my adoption and tracking down my biological father. And yeah, but I would say, does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, it's good. Yeah. So, it's all insight. There's no right or wrong answer. I don't need to tick. I don't need to issue a pass mark to your story, mate. But I'm loving to hear the take, and I'm also fascinated because I find like so many of us have a story challenged in certain ways by maladaptive behavior, whether it's saying anxiety or substance issues. And it's the resilience, right? I think baked in resilience that helps us find a pathway to turning that around, becoming something of who we can become, right? Our best expression. Do you feel like you are is that something that you're constantly seeing, your best expression? Are you seeking to be better or seeking to achieve what you want to achieve in life?
Yeah, and I'm absolutely not there yet. Yeah, I'd love to look you in the eye and say that I'm content with myself, and but no, I think well, yeah, and I also love that about myself. But I think there'll be parts of me that I'm always trying to improve and learn, and I want to stay open and curious and keep developing in different ways. Yeah,
I have a thought about safety, right? Safety is the place where we need to start to be able to take risks or put ourselves out there. What's safe for you?
whoa, big question.
Or how do you find it?
Well, you've stumped me on this question because I'm wondering if I've ever felt safe.
Yeah,
Like,
it certainly seems like you haven't sort of spent a lot of time hiding from anything.
no, yeah, but I was trying to scratch my brain and think of the last time I felt. I mean, what does safety mean? I think I'm not worried that someone's going to jump into, break into my house and harm me physically. But yeah, I think I was, that word safe was sort of resonating on more of a, how does my nervous system feel? Do I,
Yeah,
peace?
yeah,
Do
yeah.
I experience peace? I think, I've done a few, 10-day silent meditation retreats at the Vipassana Center, and I do the things to try and get there and have experienced moments of it. But yeah, I think there's such a link between childhood trauma and ADHD as well. So, I think I'm very accepting of myself. That is the one thing that I have learned, and it's a skill I'm building to be more accepting and compassionate of myself and my story and my experiences. And, I may never be the cool cucumber that, when there's a risk of something happening in the future, I'll probably always be a bit hyper vigilant and a bit ruminating about it. And it's just something I have to manage. My nervous system, I can do things to regulate it, but there's probably things I'll never fully change about myself. And, there are anatomical differences in my brain compared to someone that does not have ADHD. So, it is a neurodevelopmental difference, a divergence, so to speak. So, I think the biggest thing, and, really what my program's about working with ADHD entrepreneurs is really just embracing the you, and building everything around that to work for you. And that's how you're going to experience more flow, more peace, more enjoyment, more fulfillment.
I think that's a really good answer, mate. Especially, the impact of acceptance to provide intrinsic safety, right? I really like that idea. What do you like what do you see and admire in others that really sort of, draws you, encourages you?
Authenticity is something that I'm really magnetized by and enthralled by and inspired by, is when people are brave enough to just really be themselves, really lean into their quirks and their individuality. I find it extremely exciting. And I'm really drawn to people that have that ability, but it's a pretty rare ability to be yourself. It's very hard to be yourself.
What do you think? Because I think one of the challenges with authenticity is even knowing what it is. How do you see it in others and recognize it? What do you think it might be?
Oh yeah, I couldn't explain it to you with words. It's an energy thing. You can just tell. It's the way in which they're talking. You can feel it in their energy when they're from the part that they're speaking, their tone, their body language. You can tell when someone's speaking from the heart or from a very deep, grounded part of themselves versus, regurgitating, dogma or something in between.
Yeah, I love that idea. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to borrow? Right? Who do you want to model? Who do you want to be?
Who would I like to borrow or be? Someone who inspires me. I need to have an answer ready to go. This is like my first ever podcast. I need to have a couple of shotgun answers ready to go.
I think that's cool. Like, when you're, comfortable in your own world, right? So, maybe we could twist it and say, where do you want to be?
Where do I want to be? Not too far from where I am now in terms of the work that I'm doing, I would say. I think I'd like to work with a larger reach of people, so I think continuing to do this work and starting to do things like this, have some yarns, some recorded conversations. And, I enjoy public speaking. I want to do some more sort of speaking, storytelling. I've just started working on a new book. So yeah, I guess just continuing this work, continuing almost like a phenomenological study of myself, as I get to work with clients like me that have ADHD and are in the creative space or the entrepreneurial space.
Yeah, fantastic. And what do you I want to explore, the emotions of your future. What do what will love look like for you?
That's a tender question right now. In this very moment, but
So,
But,
well, you've got to, you've got to pay your dues in that world as well. Do you know what love is?
yeah, I do. I know love deeply and intimately. Yeah. What will it look like? Well, I hope I feel safe, and secure, and yeah, I want to be in a lovely sort of partnership with someone that we're building a life together, and going on a bit of an adventure.
Sounds great. And mate, it's been an awesome exploration, right? So, what would you like if we were to say, package up some highlights, right? How would we finish the package? What brings all of you at this stage as still a young man, still looking to create a legacy and to grow into his best expression? What would you close this chapter with?
I think there is a desire for the searching to slow down a little bit. I feel like I've been searching and searching and searching, for how to be happy, how to be fulfilled, how to be content. What my identity is, where I'm from, who's my father, which I know less about now than I ever have, funnily enough. So yeah, I think I'd like this chapter. If I wanted to sort of bookmark this chapter, I think it would be that I'm pretty content with who I am. I'll continue to learn and grow. But yeah, more of an outward focus on, helping others, be the best versions of themselves, and and really learning to embrace their story and their strengths and their passions.
Well, that is a great summary for a terrific chapter so far, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear a bit about it, and I'm looking forward to being around for the next chapter, right? So we'll chat again, man. So thank you very much, Jamie, for being on Kintsugi Heroes and sharing your story so bravely. Awesome job, man.
Thank you. It's been fun having a chat. Thanks for asking such hard-hitting questions.
You did
Dustin
great, mate.
A few of those.
First big podcast. You did a terrific job, mate. Well done. Thanks very much, mate.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Kintsugi Heroes. Thank you to Colin Lilly for permission to use Broken as our theme music for this series. If you enjoyed this conversation, share the podcast with a friend and let us know by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support Kintsugi Heroes and the stories we share, head to kintsugiheroes.com.au and follow the instructions to make a tax-deductible donation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.